The blizzard arrived without ceremony, the way grief does, sudden, absolute, erasing everything familiar. By 4 in the morning, the wind had already carved drifts against the barn doors, and Garrett Moss stood in his kitchen staring at coffee he wouldn't drink, boots already laced, body moving through rituals that no longer meant anything. 3 years since Sarah died. 3 years of waking before dawn because sleep had become a place where her absence shouted louder than her memory ever could. He shrugged into his coat, the heavy canvas one she'd given him that last Christmas, back when they still believed in miracles, and stepped into the howling dark. The cold bit through denim and bone. His truck growled to life reluctantly, headlights carving twin tunnels through horizontal snow. 400 acres of northern Wyoming ranchland stretched around him, though he couldn't see past 20 feet. The cattle needed feeding. They always needed feeding. That was the mercy of livestock. They demanded presence even when presence felt impossible. He loaded hay bales with stiff fingers, breath clouding white, thoughts empty as the fields. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Faint, almost swallowed by the storm's throat. Not the low of cattle. Not the yip of coyotes testing the wind. Something else. Something raw and desperate, a cry that pulled at something he'd thought frozen solid inside him. Garrett stopped mid-motion, hay bale suspended. Listen. There. Again. His chest tightened, the first sensation beyond numbness he'd felt in months. He set down the bale and turned toward the sound, walking past the fence line into open range where the world became nothing but white static. Snow filled his boot prints before he'd taken 3 steps. The wind tried to shove him back toward warmth, toward safety, toward the small dark house where he lived alone with photographs and silence. He kept walking. 100 yards out he found her. The foal lay collapsed in a drift, small body nearly buried, only the dark curve of her neck visible against endless white. 3 months old maybe. Coat matted with ice crystals, legs folded beneath her like broken origami. Her eyes, barely open, tracked his approach with the dull awareness of something already halfway gone. Garrett dropped to his knees in the snow. The cold soaked through his jeans immediately, but he didn't notice. His hand reached out, trembling, from cold or something deeper he couldn't say, and touched her neck. Still warm. Barely. Her heartbeat fluttered against his palm like a moth against glass. No mother. No tracks. Just this dying creature abandoned in the storm's maw. He looked around, squinting through the sideways snow, searching for any sign of where she'd come from, how she'd ended up here. Nothing. The blizzard had erased all evidence, all context. She existed in this moment only, foundering, freezing, alone. Then he saw it. On her left shoulder, visible beneath the frost, a mark. Not the clean brand of ownership ranchers used. Something crueler. Deliberate. Letters carved into flesh that had healed rough and raised. 3 shapes that looked like a soul. His stomach lurched. Someone had done this. To a foal barely old enough to stand, someone had taken a blade or a brand and marked her with violence. His jaw clenched. Sarah used to say that cruelty revealed more about the afflicted than the affliction, that hurt people, that everyone carried scars. He'd nodded along back then, agreeing in theory. But kneeling in the snow with this broken animal, her breath coming in shallow gasps, theory felt like ash in his mouth. Garrett looked back toward his truck, a dim glow in the white chaos. He could leave her. Nature took what it took, he'd seen it 1,000 times. Birth and death played out on ranches with mechanical regularity. Intervening only delayed the inevitable. He should walk away, finish feeding his cattle, go inside, pour bourbon instead of coffee, and let the storm do what storms do. His hands were already moving. He shrugged out of his coat, Sarah's last gift, still smelling faintly of wood smoke and her lavender soap, and wrapped it around the foal. She weighed almost nothing, all fragile bones and matted hair and that terrible warmth fading too fast. He lifted her against his chest, felt her heartbeat sync with his for one impossible moment, and began walking back through the storm. The wind fought him. Every step cost something. His arms burned. His face went numb. The foal's breath whispered against his collarbone, irregular, weakening. He focused on putting one boot in front of the other, on the distant glow of the barn, on not thinking about Sarah or his daughter who hadn't called in 2 years or the way his life had narrowed to this. A widower carrying a dying animal through a blizzard for reasons he couldn't articulate. The barn doors resisted, frozen shut, but he shouldered through. Inside, the silence felt cathedral deep after the storm's roar. He laid the foal on clean hay, covered her with horse blankets, stacked them thick. She didn't move. One eye opened, just one, and found his face in the lantern light. Something passed between them in that look. Recognition maybe. Two creatures acquainted with abandonment, with cold, with the specific loneliness of surviving when survival felt beside the point. Garrett sat down beside her, joints creaking, and placed his hand on her neck again. Her pulse still fluttered. Weak. Uncertain. But there. Okay, he whispered, to her or himself or the ghost of his wife watching from somewhere. Okay. I'll stay. Outside the blizzard raged. Inside, in the amber lantern glow, a broken man and a scarred foal breathed together. Neither knew what morning would bring. Neither knew how many others would eventually follow them through those barn doors, drawn by something they couldn't name. But for now, Garrett Moss, who hadn't felt purpose since the funeral, chose not to leave. And that choice, small as breath, changed everything. Dawn arrived tentative and pale, the storm's fury spent. Garrett woke slumped against the barn wall, spine complaining, fingers numb inside his gloves. For a disoriented moment he couldn't place himself. Then he saw her. The foal lay exactly where he'd left her, flanks rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Still breathing. Still here. He stood slowly, bones protesting, and fetched supplies from the tack room. Mare's milk replacer, warm water from the thermos he'd brought hours ago, a rubber nipple worn soft from previous emergencies. His hands moved with muscle memory, mixing the formula to body temperature, testing it against his wrist the way Sarah used to test bottles for their daughter. The comparison stung. He pushed it away. The foal watched him approach, ears flat, fear bright in her dark eyes. He knelt beside her, offered the bottle. She turned her head, weak but adamant. Refused. Come on, he murmured, trying again. You've got to eat. Nothing. She pressed her muzzle into the hay, retreating into whatever private darkness trauma builds inside the young. Garrett didn't force it. He'd learned patience the hard way, through Sarah's illness, through the slow unraveling of his relationship with Emma, through countless animals who taught him that trust couldn't be demanded, only offered and reoffered until it finally took root. He waited, adjusted his position, tried again with the bottle angled differently, his movements slower, his breathing deliberately calm. On the seventh attempt, she latched. The pull was tentative at first, then stronger. She drank in small, desperate gulps, milk dribbling from the corners of her mouth. Garrett felt something unlock in his chest, not relief exactly, but a loosening of the grip grief had maintained for 3 years. He watched her drink and understood, perhaps for the first time since the funeral, that keeping something alive required a specific kind of attention he'd forgotten how to give. When she'd emptied the bottle, she released the nipple and exhaled, a long shuddering breath that seemed to contain multitudes. He set the bottle aside and reached for the cloth he'd brought, dampened it with warm water, and began cleaning her coat. The ice had melted during the night, leaving her fur matted and crusted with dirt. He worked gently, methodically, revealing the gray dappled coloring beneath the grime. That's when he saw it clearly. The scar on her left shoulder, visible now in morning light streaming through gaps in the barn siding. Not a brand. Brands were utilitarian, identifying ownership. This was something else entirely, 3 letters carved deep into young flesh, healed crooked and raised. His hand stilled. Nausea climbed his throat. Someone had held this animal down. Someone had taken a blade or a burning implement and deliberately inscribed pain into her body. She'd been conscious for it. Had felt every second. The thought made him want to break things, to find whoever had done this and make them understand what they'd inflicted. Instead, he pulled out his phone and called the sheriff's office. Deputy Brennan answered on the 4th ring, voice thick with mourning. Garrett explained what he'd found, the foal, the storm, the scar. Brennan made non-committal sounds, promised to file a report, mentioned something about kids and property lines and how these things usually dead-ended without witnesses. I understand, Garrett said, though understanding felt like swallowing glass. He hung up, looked at the foal. She looked back, and in that gaze he recognized something familiar. The knowledge that justice was theoretical, that cruelty often went unanswered, that survival required making peace with scars that would never fully heal. Soul, he said quietly. That's what I'll call you. Short for Solace. Her ears flicked forward, the first gesture of curiosity she'd shown. Something about the name seemed to land. She exhaled again, softer this time, and lowered her head to rest. The days that followed established a rhythm. Every 4 hours, dawn, mid-morning, afternoon, evening, midnight, Garrett appeared with bottles. Soul grew stronger incrementally, standing on the 2nd day, taking halting steps on the 3rd. But she remained skittish, flinching at sudden movements, trembling when he reached toward her shoulder. He never pushed. Just showed up, consistent and gentle, speaking to her in low tones about nothing and everything. He told her about Sarah, about how cancer had stolen her in pieces until the woman he loved became someone he barely recognized. He told her about Emma, about the argument before she left. Something about him being emotionally unavailable, about how grief had turned him into a ghost haunting his own life. He told her about the ranch, about how 400 acres felt enormous and suffocating simultaneously when you lived them alone. Soul listened. Didn't judge. Just breathed and ate and slowly, tentatively began to trust. On the 7th morning, Garrett brought her outside. First time since the storm. She hesitated at the barn door, hooves planted, nostrils flaring at the vast white expanse. He didn't pull. Waited. Let her decide. She took one step. Then another. Her legs wobbled but held. She stood in the snow, head raised, surveying the world she'd nearly left. The sun caught her coat, made the gray dapples shimmer like river stones. For a moment, just one, she looked majestic rather than broken. Garrett watched her and felt his face do something it hadn't done in 3 years, smile. He almost didn't notice the figure by the fence. A boy, thin and motionless, watching Soul with an intensity that bordered on hunger. Garrett recognized him. Caleb from the struggling ranch 2 miles east. 10 years old, bruises occasionally visible beneath his sleeves, eyes too old for his face. She yours? Caleb asked, still not looking at Garrett. Yeah. What happened to her shoulder? Garrett's jaw tightened. Someone hurt her. Caleb nodded slowly as if this made perfect sense. As if he understood exactly what that meant. He reached through the fence rails, hand extended, and Soul, who'd shied from everyone, who'd been nothing but fear and flight, walked toward him and pressed her muzzle into his palm. The boy's face crumpled. I got scars too, he whispered. But nobody sees them. Caleb returned the next afternoon, walking the 2 miles from his father's ranch with his hands shoved deep in his pockets and his gaze fixed on the ground. Garrett saw him coming from the kitchen window, a small figure moving through the landscape like something uncertain of its right to exist. He met the boy at the gate without speaking, just opened it and gestured toward the barn. Some invitations required silence. Soul lifted her head when they entered, nostrils flaring, then relaxed when she recognized Caleb's scent. The boy approached slowly, reverently, and ran his fingers along her neck with a gentleness that spoke of practice, of knowing how fragile things broke and how carefully they needed handling. Garrett handed him a brush without explanation. Caleb took it and began working through Soul's mane, methodical and patient, his thin shoulders gradually loosening from their habitual hunch. My dad drinks, Caleb said after 20 minutes, his voice barely audible over the whisper of bristles through hair. Gets mean when he does. Garrett continued mucking the stall, giving the boy space to speak or not speak, whichever felt safer. He'd learned this during Sarah's illness, that sometimes presence mattered more than response, that witnessing could be its own form of healing. I hide in the barn when it gets bad, Caleb continued. The horses there, they don't judge. They just let me sit with them. You can sit here too, Garrett said. Anytime. The boy looked up, hope and disbelief warring across his young face. Really? Really? Come after school. Weekends. Whenever you need. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a crack in the armor children build when the world proves unsafe. He returned to brushing Soul, but his movements carried less tension now, less of the coiled readiness to flee or fight that Garrett recognized from his own mirror. Word spread the way it does in small communities, not through announcements but through whispered conversations and careful observations. The rancher with the scarred foal who let broken kids visit. No therapy speak, no programs or protocols. Just a gate that opened and a man who understood that healing often looked like brushing a horse in comfortable silence. Mia arrived on a gray Saturday, brought by her foster mother who waited anxiously in the truck. 12 years old, dark braids, eyes that held oceans of unspoken things. She hadn't spoken in 6 months, not since whatever had happened in her previous placement, details the foster mother sketched vaguely while Garrett nodded and understood that some stories resisted telling. He handed Mia a brush without preamble. She took it, walked into Soul's paddock, and stood motionless for 5 minutes before the foal approached her. When Soul's muzzle touched Mia's palm, the girl's lips trembled but no sound emerged. She pressed her forehead against Soul's neck and stayed that way until her foster mother called that it was time to leave. She returned every weekend after that. Never speaking but her presence growing more solid, less ghost-like. Garrett watched her gradually relax, saw how she began initiating contact with Soul rather than waiting to be approached. Noticed the day she smiled at something Caleb said even though she didn't respond aloud. Then Daniel appeared. The truck announced him, an old Ford with a dented fender and military plates. He emerged slowly, 40s, weathered, wearing a jacket with a Ranger tab and eyes that had witnessed too much. He stood at the fence for 10 minutes before Garrett walked over, two men assessing each other with the careful evaluation of those acquainted with damage. "Heard you got a horse that helps," Daniel said finally. "She listens," Garrett replied. Daniel's jaw worked. "I got PTSD. Haven't slept through the night in 8 years. Can't be around crowds. Wife left. Kids don't call." The words came flat, factual, stripped of the emotion that would make them unbearable to speak. "Thought maybe?" He trailed off, looking at Soul, who'd wandered over to investigate. "Come on," Garrett said. Daniel spent 3 hours in the paddock that first day, sitting cross-legged in the dirt while Soul grazed nearby. He didn't touch her. Didn't speak. Just breathed in time with her movements, his shoulders gradually dropping from their defensive hike, his hands unclenching from fists he probably didn't know he'd made. When he left, his eyes were wet. "I'll come back," he said, half question, half statement. Doors always open. By spring, the ranch had transformed without Garrett quite noticing. 8 regulars now, Caleb and Mia, Daniel and a single mother named Rachel whose autistic son found peace in Soul's steady presence, a teenage girl with cutting scars hidden beneath long sleeves, an elderly veteran who'd survived Vietnam but hadn't survived the homecoming, 2 brothers in foster care who'd learned that adults couldn't be trusted but horses could. They arrived separately, stayed together, formed a constellation of brokenness that somehow generated its own light. Garrett built benches. Daniel helped construct a shelter. Rachel organized a schedule. Nobody called it therapy or healing or recovery, those words felt too clinical, too prescriptive. It was just a place where damaged people met a damaged horse and discovered that survival could be communal rather than solitary. One evening in late April, when the valley had begun greening and the last snow had retreated to shaded hollows, they gathered around the fire pit Garrett had built. Soul grazed nearby, her coat glossy now, her movements confident. The scar on her shoulder caught the firelight, transformed from a mark of cruelty into something else, evidence of endurance, testimony to the possibility of continuing despite everything. Mia sat beside Soul, running her fingers along the raised letters, tracing SOL with the concentration of someone reading Braille. The group had fallen into comfortable silence, the kind that didn't require filling. Then Mia opened her mouth and for the first time in 7 months, spoke. "Thank you," she whispered. 2 words. But they detonated the quiet. Rachel pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming. Caleb grinned so wide it looked painful. Daniel stood and walked to Mia, placed a careful hand on her shoulder, squeezed once. Garrett turned away because he was crying too, because something enormous had just happened and he needed a moment to absorb it. He walked to the fence line and pulled out his phone, stared at the contact he'd saved months ago under a new name, Hope. His daughter, Emma, who hadn't spoken to him in 2 years. His thumb hovered over the call button. Behind him, he heard the others talking softly, heard Mia's voice joining theirs, tentative but present. He thought about Sarah, about how she'd always said that broken things could still be beautiful, that scars were just stories the body told about survival. He pressed call. It rang once, twice. Then, Dad? Emma arrived on a Thursday in June, driving the same Subaru she'd left in 2 years prior, though now it carried different cargo. Legal documents for nonprofit status, grant applications, a laptop filled with spreadsheets and hope. She stepped out into the golden afternoon light, 32 years old and carrying her mother's eyes, her father's stubborn jaw, and 2 years of anger that had fermented into something softer, more like understanding. Garrett met her at the gate. They stood 3 feet apart, an ocean of unsaid things between them, until Soul wandered over and nuzzled Emma's hand. The gesture broke something. Emma laughed, surprised, delighted, and Garrett felt his throat close because that laugh was Sarah's, perfectly preserved in their daughter. "She's beautiful," Emma said. "She's the reason I called." "I know." Emma looked at him, really looked, and he saw her register the changes. The softness around his eyes, the way he stood less like a man bracing for impact and more like someone who'd remembered how to inhabit his own body. "You look different, Dad." "I am different." She stayed. Not in the main house at first, that felt too immediate, too presumptuous, but in the small cabin they'd built for seasonal help. She spent her days observing, asking questions, meeting the regulars who cycled through. Caleb, now confident enough to teach newcomers how to approach the horses. Mia, whose vocabulary expanded daily, who'd started writing poetry about survival. Daniel, who'd stopped flinching at loud noises, who slept 6 hours most nights, who'd reconciled with his oldest daughter. Emma watched her father with them, patient, present, offering exactly what each person needed without being asked, and realized this was who he'd been trying to become during her mother's illness but couldn't because grief kept interrupting. She saw how the ranch had given him permission to rebuild himself through helping others rebuild themselves. "We should formalize this," she told him one evening on the porch, Soul grazing nearby as fireflies sparked in the dusk. "Make it official. Solace Ranch. A non-profit. Therapy program. We could help so many more people." Garrett considered this, weighing institutionalization against impact. "As long as it doesn't lose what makes it work." "It won't. I promise." They shook on it, father and daughter, architects of something neither could have built alone. The ranch transformed. Emma's organizational genius married to Garrett's intuitive understanding of trauma created something extraordinary. They acquired more horses, all rescues, all carrying visible or invisible scars. They built additional shelters, expanded the paddock, established partnerships with therapists and veterans organizations and foster care systems. Word spread beyond the valley, then beyond the state. Solace Ranch became a pilgrimage site for the broken, a place where healing happened in the spaces between words. But the true miracle arrived on an August afternoon when temperatures climbed toward 90 and the sky stretched blue and infinite overhead. A family's car came up the long drive, dust trailing like a veil. Parents emerged first, exhausted, hopeful, desperate in the particular way people become when conventional medicine has offered its final shrug. Then they lifted a boy from the back seat, 8 years old, transferring him carefully to a wheelchair. His name was Jonah. Cerebral palsy. The doctors had been definitive. He would never walk. His mother's voice trembled when she explained why they'd come. "We heard stories about impossible things becoming possible here. About hope." Garrett knelt beside the wheelchair, eye level with Jonah. The boy's gaze was sharp, intelligent, trapped in a body that wouldn't obey. "You want to meet Soul?" Jonah's head moved slightly, his version of a nod. They brought him to the paddock where Soul stood in the shade, now fully grown, majestic, the scar on her shoulder visible but no longer defining. She approached the wheelchair with the careful dignity she'd developed, lowered her head, and breathed softly against Jonah's hand. The boy's face transformed. Pure joy, unfiltered and radiant. "Can he ride her?" the father asked, voice breaking on the question. Garrett looked at Emma. She looked at Daniel and Caleb and Mia, who'd gathered to watch. Everyone nodded. They lifted Jonah with reverent care, positioned him on Soul's broad back. Garrett took the lead rope. Emma walked on one side, Daniel on the other. Soul began moving, each step deliberate and measured, as if she understood the sacredness of her cargo. Jonah sat taller than he ever had. His head lifted, eyes wide with wonder. "I'm flying," he whispered. His mother covered her mouth, tears streaming. His father's hand found hers. Then something impossible occurred. Jonah's legs, withered, weak, supposedly useless, began moving. Just slightly. Just enough. His thighs pressed against Soul's sides, seeking purchase, seeking connection. His feet, twisted inward since birth, flexed. "Oh my God," Emma breathed. "He's using his legs." Garrett stopped walking. Looked up at Jonah. The boy was crying now, but his smile blazed bright enough to ignite the world. "Do you feel that?" Garrett asked. Jonah nodded, this time unmistakably. "That's not just your legs. That's your spirit remembering what it's capable of. That's hope, and it's real, and nobody can ever take it from you." Soul turned her head, looked directly at Garrett, and in her dark eyes he saw everything. The blizzard, the barn, the choice to stay, the people who'd followed, the miracle of transformation that happens when broken things refuse to remain broken. The scar on her shoulder caught the sunlight, no longer a wound, but a testament. Proof that cruelty doesn't get the final word. That love, patient and persistent, rewrites endings. That evening, as the family departed and the regulars gathered for dinner, Garrett stood alone in the paddock with Soul. He pressed his forehead to hers, felt her breath warm against his chest. "We did it," he whispered. "We actually did it." Soul exhaled, and it sounded like agreement, like benediction, like the beginning of every story that matters, the moment when someone chooses, against all logic, to hope. The story of Solace Ranch is real. But it's not the only one. Somewhere right now, another broken soul is finding healing in the most unexpected place. Another miracle is unfolding in the quiet. Now, click on the video on the screen to hear a story even more miraculous than this one. You'll cry and then feel whole again. Click it now, we'll be waiting.